It was on 17th February 1952 that former naval intelligence officer and journalist Ian Lancaster Fleming sat down in front of his typewriter at his Jamaican estate Goldeneye, just above Oracabessa Bay, lit himself a Moreland cigarette, and began to type the very first words of Casino Royale. Typing 2,000 words every morning directly from his experiences and imagination, he finished the first draft in just under 2 months. James Bond was born. Referring to his novel as the spy story to end all spy stories, Ian Fleming had unwittingly laid the foundation for a film franchise that would span 6 decades and fascinate millions of fans in all corners of the world. Only 1 year after Casino Royale was published and sold out 3 times, American television network CBS acquired the rights for a TV adaptation directly from Ian Fleming. Adapted for the screen by Anthony Ellis and Charles Bennett, the 1-hour-long feature was filmed at CBS Television City in Los Angeles and aired on October 21, 1954, as part of the dramatic anthology series Climax Mystery Theater. Featuring a stellar cast led by Barry Nelson as James Bond, Linda Christian as Valerie Mathis, and Peter Lorre as the cold and calculating villain Le Chiffre, it was the first ever filmed adaptation of a James Bond adventure.
All right, Mr. Bond. Where's that money? Look, Mr. Bond, as you should know by now, I'm quite without mercy, and if you continue to be that obstinate, I'll have to torture you. You'll be tortured to the edge of madness. Believe me, you have no hope whatsoever, you hear? None.
It would take 8 more years and the powerful partnership of 2 visionary film producers to finally turn James Bond into a cinema experience for the whole world to see. Having secured the rights to James Bond, and having founded their holding company Danjaq, film producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman sat down with production company United Artists in New York on June 21, 1961, to agree on a deal for making the first feature film. The meeting lasted no more than 40 minutes and was a cornerstone moment for the cinematic James Bond franchise. United Artists agreed to back the production with $1 million and distribute it with a 40% revenue share. It was everything or nothing for Broccoli and Saltzman when cameras began rolling on location for Dr. No at Palisadoes Airport in Jamaica on 16th of January 1962. Their instincts were right. It was the beginning of the longest and most successful film series in cinema history, with a total of 25 films and 6 actors portraying the iconic character on the silver screen.
I am Ernst Stavro Blofeld.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Blofeld.
Are you ready, Mr. Bond?
Ready?
Welcome, James. It's been a long time. Finally, here we are. Cuckoo.
Every good story needs an antagonist, and so they needed to find their James Bond to kickstart that whole series with. And they looked at a lot of actors. Cary Grant, he was deemed too expensive. David Niven, not tough enough. Patrick McGoohan, they looked at. He declined on moral grounds. but distributor United Artists, they wanted a big name, which of course was difficult for Eon Productions, because try to tie down a big name for a series of 6 films that they had planned. And actually, it was actress Lana Turner, who was working with Sean Connery at the time at the film Another Time, Another Place, who introduced Connery to producer Albert R. Broccoli. This was the second time where Broccoli saw Connery in action in the Disney musical Darby O'Gill and the Little People. And Broccoli thought Connery was really an incredible actor and had an incredible presence, but he was unsure about whether he had any sex appeal. Nevertheless, they brought Connery in, and he met with producers Broccoli and Saltzman in the Eon office in London's South Audley Street, where it was at the time. And when they asked him to do a screen test, he said he was way past that, because he was already an established actor. They should just take it or leave it. That's what he told them, and it was not what ultimately landed him the role. What landed him the role was Broccoli and Saltzman were watching him when he left the Eon offices in London, and they noted that he had a particular stride. He walked almost like a cat. And then they realized he did have that sex appeal after all.
Sean Connery was one of the first screen heroes who was a good guy with a black hat, meaning he could be dark, he could be cruel, and he could be the character in the novel that Fleming did so wonderfully. And prior to that time and after that time, heroes are very obvious on screen and villains are very obvious. So Connery is a dark anti-hero. Sean had that magnificent screen presence that women wanted to flock to the films. And the little boys watching the film grew up to be older men. They're in their 70s, sometimes their 80s. And still as adults, they hero worship Sean. Sean has had a tremendous physical presence. When you were in the room, you were very aware of him at all times.
He really defined the genre. He can do so much with his facial expressions, like he can just move an eyebrow and express so much emotion that he doesn't really need any words for.
He gave us the pattern. He truly gave us the template to which every Bond, and even the actors who play the other Bonds would say this, that every Bond would be compared. He is James Bond, and everybody else is playing the James Bond that he created in a way.
Dr. No was a success at the UK box office, and it left United Artists very surprised, because for them, they thought it was a B movie and they didn't like it at all. But audiences were fascinated, and Sean Connery shot to stardom overnight, literally. And not only did the first films of the Bond series kickstart his career, they started the 60s spy craze at a high point of the Cold War.
There are a lot of iconic scenes, like scenes that you would instantly recognize as this is from that film and that's from this film, like the beach scenes in Dr. No, or when Oddjob tries to decapitate Bond with his hat, or Rosa Klebb tries to kill him with the tip of her shoe. The girl painted in gold lying on the bed. Everybody knows that that's from Goldfinger. The introduction of the car is a very important part, I think, in the 60s. And maybe that's just because those are my favorite, or that's my favorite decade. I find that those are instantly recognizable.
The moments in the Alps, yeah, that's classic Bond. I love it. The scenery, the driving, the gadgets, all those moments. The moment when Bond is looking at Goldfinger and Oddjob, and Goldfinger's having an ice cream. You know, it's a typical Bond moment, and I really love that. And I love the action. I love the style, the Bond style.
There were other moments that pepper the 60s. I would say you had a wonderful mix of humor and action, but also great dialogue, wonderful scripts, punchy scripts. From Russia with Love is an excellent spy film if you knew nothing about the Bond series, just a great spy thriller. And then, of course, Goldfinger and Bond Mania. Thunderball is even bigger, selling more tickets. And then You Only Live Twice, the big sets, the big action, the big score, beautiful cinematography. You Only Live Twice is a gorgeous film to watch. So the first 5 Eon films made sure that they would be doing the film 60 years from then. Although when the lawsuit happened and Kevin McClory had won the rights to remake Thunderball 10 years later, that'd be what, 1975. At the time it was reported Broccoli and Saltzman were laughing, saying, we'll never make Bond films 10 years from now.
Goldfinger has to stand out because I think it's where they hit upon everything that we know in the formula. From a style standpoint, that 3-piece suit is so iconic. When you look up Sean Connery, James Bond, typically you'll see him standing in that, wonderful Kentucky suit that he has, that Glen check. But I do think that, the Goldfinger moments, the villain, where literally they named the film after the villain hits on all of the tropes that we know and love. To me, those portions, what stands out to me, and I almost have to say this, is the style. This was a man who patterned himself because he could die tomorrow. So he bought the best clothes, the best watches, he had the best drinks. He traveled in the best way. And mind you, he was a company expense man. I realized that. It wasn't on his own dime, but it didn't matter. He was introducing an audience who was very satiated and wearing kind of the same thing everybody else was wearing into something very different. I do think that there was also a certain harshness to this hero that I think about in the 60s. He would slap people around, women, men, it really didn't matter to him. He was, dare I say, gender neutral when it came to that type of aspect. So that's a takeaway.
Of course, those movies are relevant because they laid the groundwork of James Bond, and without those movies, we wouldn't have the series that we have today. Still, to my movie taste, they're quite far away, and I don't rewatch them very often. But I think what I find remarkable, if you take into account how old they are, I think it's really impressive what they've pulled off technically. And even though at the beginning, when Bond wasn't that big of a phenomenon, they still could go on, and they pulled it off. Just altogether, that's what I found most impressive.
Apparently it wasn't always easy with Sean Connery, a man who longed for more character development, better scripts, polished dialogues for the Bond films, and already at the time when Thunderball was made, not having expected the immense success the Bond films would have, he had thought about leaving the role again. And it was the time it took to make a Bond film that was straining his relationship to the producers, Broccoli and Saltzman. Plus the fact that he was trying to renegotiate his contract from the 5% of the profits that he would receive to 10%. That also did its bit for sure. Then there was the Japan shoot of You Only Live Twice, a terrible nightmare for him and the entire film crew. Hundreds of paparazzi who also followed him to the toilet. Imagine that happens to you when you're an actor. That would scare you off pretty easily. And then there was this image the press painted about him as Bond, solely focusing on Bond, not on everything else he had done in his career. He wanted out. And when Her Majesty the Queen asked him at the premiere of You Only Live Twice if this was his last 007 film, she was quite surprised. He answered very politely, "I'm afraid so, ma'am." And that was it. In early 1968, Connery still insisted on 10% of the profits and reportedly said he would want to do another film. I think he said it to Harry Saltzman. But it was producer Albert R. Broccoli who asked himself and his partner, do we want him to do it? Do we want someone who constantly says he doesn't want to be Bond anymore? And that was when the first major change was to hit the young franchise, the change of the leading man. Over 400 actors were considered for that part. And then suddenly, curtain up for George Lazenby's story. Long-haired George with sideburns. Not at all looking like the other actors waiting to be tested. So he saw that, and he saw how they looked like, and he thought, okay, I'm not right here. Off he went to Connery's barber, then located at the Dorchester Hotel in London, then on to tailor Anthony Sinclair, who did Connery's suits for his appearance as Bond. There was not a suit that fit George Lazenby, but there was a rejected suit that Connery hadn't picked up, and it fit Lazenby like wax. And then, confident and sly as a fox, Lazenby made it to the office of casting director Dyson Lovell at Ian Productions, leaned in the doorframe and said, "I heard you're looking for James Bond." It's a nice coincidence that Dyson Lovell was at that moment on the phone with producer Harry Saltzman and told him, "I think here's somebody you should look at."
The producers were absolutely, they had their hands in their hair. What are we going to do? Sean left us, and then they got George. And how they got George, there are different stories. There's a story that George rang and he walked in and he said, "I am your James Bond." There's a story that Broccoli was in a restaurant and George was also there, and they were introduced and they were talking, and then George showed on the audition that his fighting skills, and then he was hired. I'm not sure which story George is telling everyone, but I think it's the last one. You don't know it, George, for sure.
And George also very handsome off screen, very commanding, and had what they call the it factor, where you see them off camera and you say, wow, they're magnetic, they're charismatic. I would say what most people say, George Lazenby acted very well in his very first Hollywood film and was very brave as far as working through an injured shoulder and other injuries on set and dealing with gossip and dealing with publicity. And both men did superbly well, and we're grateful to them as fans, absolutely.
I think there's two things that make George Lazenby stand out, and one is to his credit, and one is to the credit of the people around him. First of all, he was put in one of the best movies ever. And I don't mean just a James Bond movie. I mean, it's a phenomenal movie. It's a almost direct translation from the Ian Fleming book. And the closer they get to the books, the more successful the movies have been. It's nearly proven. So he was put into a wonderful situation, surrounded by incredible artists, a wonderful, wonderful Bond girl, very strong in and of herself. But the second thing, and I've got to give George credit here, is, to use Frank Sinatra, he did it his way. I can't sing like you, but he just went in there and he was George. And I think there's a certain authenticity to it. I think he gets dinged quite a bit for not being the typical Bond actor. But there's a charm in and of itself. When he walks through a scene, it's pretty much him. And I think once you know that, once you have that knowledge, it makes it very authentic.
I don't think anyone else would have dared to do what he did, to step into that role. He had everything or nothing to risk, and he spent a year pursuing the role, as we know. I would say it's definitive in terms of, if you want to see how great a writer Fleming was, and you're still not sure about reading the Fleming books, watch Majesties, then get into the novel. You'll get so much more.
It's a nice story. It's all played. It's nicely done. It fits the Bond spy thing, that he's getting married, and that he loses the love of his life, and it still follows him in all those movies. Every moment, every time when a girl or a woman gets too close with Bond, Bond walks away. Bond gets his hedge up. I think that defines the films after George his film.
Sean Connery was a tough act to follow, and I'm not a huge fan of George Lazenby. The film has grown on me as a film and as a story. That has grown on me, and it kind of stands alone because of the story. But because Sean Connery kind of put his mark on the role in such a strong way in those first films that he made, it was really difficult for him for George Lazenby to make a mark himself. Like they say in the opening sequence, this wouldn't have happened to the other fella. So it really is difficult to step into those shoes. And that's kind of maybe a harsh criticism, but all in all, he doesn't convince me in the role. He comes across a bit too smooth for my taste. But the film itself is very convincing in the sense that it has a very interesting storyline, and one that stands out from all the others of that time.
On Her Majesty's Secret Service was a commercial and critical success. There's no doubt about that. But George Lazenby wasn't as popular with everyone as he probably thought he was. The shoot in Switzerland, for instance, was difficult. Lazenby did not get along with director Peter Hunt, nor with his co-star Diana Rigg. And on a trip to Geneva, when he had a day off, he had illegally bought some firearms and later fired them on location in Muren, just for fun. That never happened to the other fella. And it is said that upon leaving the role, Lazenby acted on advice of his personal guru he had at the time. His name was Ronan O'Rahilly. I heard a different story, but verification is pending, shall we say, so I'm not going to go into that. Trying to find a replacement for Lazenby, they found that none of the actors they tested had any star quality. The only one close was John Gavin, and Broccoli was very much in favor of him, but under pressure to start filming, Gavin was announced as the new James Bond at the end of January 1971, but United Artists president David Picker had a veto right, and he blocked it, brought up Sean Connery again. They had to get him back on his terms to save the franchise after what happened with George Lazenby. And United Artists president David Picker put $1.25 million on the table, plus a 12.5% of the gross of Diamonds Are Forever, the next film, plus the proposal to back 2 film projects of Connery of his own choosing. If that isn't a good package, I don't know what is. And at the time, the fee of $1.25 million entered the Guinness Book of World Records for the highest payment of an actor in cinema history.
So it's an incredible large amount of money for one more movie. And you absolutely see that Connery doesn't like playing the character. He looks very tired making that film, you know. He doesn't portray Bond, he portrays him more like an old Bond, you know, who has to do a mission and okay, he does it, and that's a thing, that's what he does.
You know, somehow as a fan, as a very close fan, it's become white noise. It doesn't bother me anymore. And I think a part of it is because I can start to see Bond more as a character than as an individual actor. And once you start to do that, once you see it as a character analysis, as opposed to an actor analysis, it's a little easier to digest.
The transition from You Only Live Twice to On a Majesty's and then to Diamonds, it's completely, it's messy. That's how I think it is.
I have friends who sat down with him for dinner for 2-3 hours and talked about those things, and he lived without regrets. He didn't regret coming back because he benefited the Scottish Boys Trust that he had founded with Diamonds Are Forever, at the time the highest paid movie star in the world ever. And he didn't regret Never Say Never Again because he helped screenwrite it. He had, at that point, he was editing his own scripts the way Roger Moore does, or did, and he was putting in his own input, and he chose a director and so on. And I think both Diamonds and Never Say Never Again, I enjoy them very much. He did a great job. He had no regrets. From all that I've heard and all that I experienced from him, he had no regrets.
It was certainly a gamble, but United Artists had been right. Diamonds Are Forever was double the box office of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But there was a clear understanding between United Artists and Sean Connery that he would only do this one film. And so after Diamonds Are Forever, Sean Connery left for good. In many ways, the 1960s were the defining decade for Bond. The fictional character had become this pop culture phenomenon, and the franchise had a solid base to continue from. Today we look back on these films and say, wow, look what they achieved. But we also see the darker sides. Racism and sexism, for instance. The treatment of women is generally not looked at favorably, but there were also strong exceptions.
I was raised by a mom who was a very cool person in the 1960s. She was very much active in the New York scene in the 1960s, and she wasn't an actress herself, but she certainly enjoyed the spy craze of the 60s. So I grew up watching things like The Avengers and Man from U.N.C.L.E., and I was taught to appreciate Mrs. Emma Peel. In fact, my first cat was Mrs. Emma Peel, so I always grew up respecting these strong women characters. And yeah, I know there are some James Bond girls that are not strong, but I don't think you can argue that Diana Rigg, if not the greatest Bond girl in Tracy, she is probably one of the strongest Bond girls ever. And so was Honor Blackman. And eventually I did see Goldfinger, and of course that's with Sean Connery. And I really started to be attracted to the Bond films that had the stronger Bond girls in them.
When you look at the portrayal of the Bond girls, I find always that there are two parts to the whole thing, because you have the Bond women who they have careers that make them independent, and they make their own decisions and have their own careers. And then on the other hand, you have the girls or the women that are, let's say, have a more traditional role for that time and get treated with less respect, you could say. But I always find that in the Bond genre, the role of the women, or the way that the Bond franchise dealt with the women in the 60s is a bit unfairly looked at, because when you look at the films of the 60s that weren't the Bond films, that's how women were portrayed in other films as well. And I think it's because you have this long line of films that go back to 1962 that you always compare the modern portrayal of the women to the older portrayal of the women, and then of course it stands out just because in society it was more accepted to treat women on less of an equal level. I find that when you look at Honor Blackman in Goldfinger and the role that she played, she's a very tough woman and has her own opinions, has her own job, has her own mind. Of course, you have scenes that make you cringe, like when they get a smack on the bottom to leave the room or leave the side of the pool, whatever. But like I said, you have that in other films as well of that time.
Moving into the 1970s, the relationship between producers Broccoli and Saltzman had taken a turn for the worse. Harry Saltzman's investments into other film projects had almost driven him into ruin, and he constantly borrowed money as a loan from Danjak, the holding company he ran with Albert R. Broccoli to make the Bond films. And in the end, Broccoli put a stop to it, and it created a deep rift between the men. Amidst all this turmoil, a new Bond had to be found. And they found him in Roger Moore, who was doing The Persuaders at Pinewood Studios at that time, together with Tony Curtis. And Roger Moore, Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman frequently met, even playing cards together and stuff. But Broccoli thought Moore was too fat, and when they presented him to United Artists, President David Picker said, "Oh, he has all this long hair in his back, and that doesn't look like a Bond." And producer Harry Saltzman picked up the phone and called Roger Moore and asked him, "What are you going to do about it, being too fat and having long hair in the back?" And Roger Moore's answer was simple: "I'll lose weight and get a haircut."
We got a completely different character with Roger Moore, because Roger Moore is a man who loves to laugh. Was a man who has a lot of humor. The man, it's known that the man absolutely hated firearms. He just absolutely hated to fire a gun, because he was a peace-loving, a very likable gentleman. That's the big thing that changed. He was softer than Sean Connery. Sean Connery was a tough Bond, a man who kicks ass. Sean Connery had style. He was a gentleman, but Roger Moore as Bond was the gentleman. The man had so much style. The man had so much charisma. He absolutely got everyone with his, especially with his voice, with his low baritone voice that he had. He is thanking Moneypenny for not blowing his cover that there is a girl in a blue dress in his dresser. It's a crazy thing. It's absolutely so different than Connery, because they had to be different.
Sean's Bond was a little bit different. Sean's Bond was, all of this is too incredible to believe, so I won't really believe it. and I'll just go on and I'll do what I need to do. But what makes the Roger Moore films great is he doesn't always get the biggest villains playing opposite him, but whoever he's working with, there's a great tension, and there's a sense of, I understand you, and I admire you, and I know you, but I have to defeat you.
When I kill, it's on the specific orders of my government. And those I kill are themselves killers.
Oh, come, Mr. Bond, you disappoint me. You get as much fulfillment out of killing as I do, so why don't you admit it?
I admit killing you would be a pleasure.
Again, this is Ian Fleming's work. Ian Fleming is great for many reasons. One is his villains are great, and some of the most interesting, surreal, bizarre villains came right from the pages of Fleming to the Roger Moore films in particular.
It's something that many people sort of criticize or are not fans of, is that more lighthearted approach and this tongue-in-cheek thing, of course, that Roger Moore was famous for. But that's actually something I really, really enjoy. So when I go back to the, let's say, older portion of the Bond movies, I really love to go back to the Roger Moore ones. And I really have a soft spot for movies like Moonraker, The Man with the Golden Gun, Live and Let Die, and so on. So I really think those are fantastic movies. And as opposed to the early Connery ones, at least to me, they hold up very nicely. I can watch them through without skipping major parts of the movie and find them very enjoyable.
He's much more of a smooth character as a James Bond. But what I find with the humor, which I like, is that humor I find always distances you from the action. And Sean Connery had his humor as well in the films, but it was a different kind of humor. And with Roger Moore, it's more of a light-hearted humor that distances you from the immediacy of the dangerous situation. So that I find always with the Roger Moore that I don't really get drawn into the danger or the risk of the scene as much because of the fact that there is this humor. Like, for example, in Octopussy, when he's in the gorilla costume and then he looks at his watch. I mean, that's a fabulous scene and I love it. But of course, it takes away from this risk and takes you out and makes you laugh. And, you know, it's going to resolve in a positive way for James Bond. So I find that the nuance just shifted a little bit into the smoother, more light-hearted nuance of the character.
I tell fans, if you watch Live and Let Die carefully, Roger Moore never breaks character. Some people say, oh, he's just being the saint, or he's being his usual silly self. He's very solid. He interrogates Jane Seymour kind of rigorously. He's just taken her virginity. He's just seduced her. He's just broken her power. And what resonates on screen is he likes what he's doing. He's excited to be encountering a villain who's so brilliant as Dr. Kananga, or so incredibly learned as Scaramanga, who's made himself from nothing but has this incredible Solex agitator that he's stolen. But Bond's interested in the science, Bond's interested in his laboratory. Roger Moore loved to meet people and gain new knowledge, and that comes across in his character of Bond.
There's a certain charm and playfulness to Bond. And of course, Roger Moore brought that as part of his own personality. You see that when he played the Saint, and I think he transferred some of that as well. But what I think it did from the Bond character standpoint is an understanding that this man could truly charm both men and women. He could be very charming and use that as a spy's tool, less about Connery's danger. Like Connery, you feel like he could kill a person very easily. Same with Daniel Craig. But Roger Moore seems like he could walk into the room and raise his arched eyebrow and have a glib line and a smirk. He's also a very handsome gentleman. And I feel like women would turn to Puddles. And I think men would want to be more like him and therefore gravitate to him. And maybe even, I dare say, want him to come onto their side.
We went to see The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977. And that was the first Bond film I ever saw at the pictures, and Roger Moore, he was just absolute star. He was, for me, he was everything that I ever thought a man could be, everything I ever thought a gentleman could be, and he was everything I wanted to be when I grew up. You know, he was kind of absolute, just the pinnacle of like class. And being an Englishman.
Roger Moore really can pull off this gentleman side, this stiff upper lip British side, this humorous side, but I still think he carries himself quite well in some of the action scenes. Maybe in the later movies, especially in A View to a Kill, of course, you can tell that he gets quite old, as everybody knows, but I still think he pulls off these things nicely, yeah.
He had a more, let's say, a more reticent style. With Sean Connery, you kind of believe that he is going to become violent towards the henchman or whoever is in his way. And with Roger Moore, I always feel that he's holding back a bit and waiting whether it's really necessary to use violence.
Mr. Bond, it's good to see you again.
Live and Let Die was this relatively serious take. It was, it had essence of Connery still in it, where the way he dressed was rather a sartorial Brit. It was of the time, but very buttoned up, just like Connery did. As you move into The Man with the Golden Gun, he gets a little bit more playful. What's that? Safari suits? Safari tops? Jeans? Dare I say, a black short sleeve top? So I think the playfulness, the wittiness, the one-liners started to grow through The Man with the Golden Gun, and thus the humor. I think Spy kind of backs down. You've now got this larger than life. It wasn't a small little backwater adventure anymore. No, this was now epic.
And then one of the most iconic Bond moments ever is that the car goes underwater and it becomes a submarine. Wow. Iconic, and very, very nicely played by Bond, Bond isn't a stupid person. He is very intelligent. He has to get the action done on the spot. Of course, it's a bit silly that he can drive the car well, he can fly, he can use a boat incredibly, he can do anything, he can fly a space shuttle, he can do anything. Okay, but that's Bond, because Bond can do anything. He's James Bond, he's a super spy.
Alone at last.
And I also have a soft spot for the chase in The Man with the Golden Gun, the car chase, because again, it works very, very nicely with the Bond theme and the spin. I also have a soft spot for that one, and I love those cars that you can see in those scenes.
The car that flips as it goes over the bridge, yeah. Or the non-existent bridge, the hardly existent bridge, yeah. So, yeah, that's for me the most memorable. That's the one that stands out.
Star Wars was a big hit, and Cubby thought, well, let's make a space movie. Moonraker isn't my favorite. The space thing doesn't grab me. I think it's a bit over the top. Why does James Bond has to go to space? Is that really the thing that he needs to do? Yeah, and at the moment when the pigeon is doing this with his head, and then the dog who, it's completely tongue-in-cheek. It's not a spy movie then. It's a comedy, and it suits the era, but it's over the top. It's a bit too much.
Watching a pigeon do a double take is 2 seconds of film. It's not 2 hours of film. Moonraker takes it on the chin a lot for those reasons. But Moonraker is one of the most lavish films ever done. It's absolutely astonishing. If you watch it on a large TV like I have here in my Bond room, it's like the space shuttle is taking off, but it never took off. It was all fake before the shuttle had ever launched for the film. It was all special effects. So Moonraker and all these films that get parodied or people don't like them. And remember, I was a kid when it came out. Moonraker was very highly reviewed by critics and drew in audiences, the likes of which we hadn't seen since Goldfinger. According to inflation, a lot of the Roger Moore films outperformed the Pierce Brosnan films. So Roger was terrific Bond, and I disagree that the filmmakers doing what they had to do, making their 10th, 11th, 13th, 14th film, let's try something different. Let's inject a little humor. Let's have a little fun. Because in a sense, the Bond's world is a little bit larger than life. And your natural reaction is to kind of laugh and go, this is strange. This is fun and weird, but bizarre. And even the way you're going to torture me or kill me is clever and creative. So we look for humor. Who wants to watch 25 films, 27 films and not laugh? That doesn't make any sense.
The President's Suite.
Really? Well, don't bother showing me the rest. If I get lost, I'll take a cab.
As a family, we just came out really happy. That was the thing that I remember about the films, is we went into the cinema and we may have had arguments, or my sister may have wanted to go and see a different film, or she wanted to go and do something else, and you know, and my mum and dad argued. But when we came out of the cinema, we were all really happy, because we'd just seen Roger Moore go into space in a space shuttle with the most unbelievable one-liner that you'll ever hear in your life, when Q asks what Bond's doing.
007. My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
Even though at the time I couldn't really understand what was going on, but my mum and dad, they laughed like crazy.
It felt like the producers really understood the Bond he brought to the table. It wasn't, we just have a generic James Bond character and we're going to write around him. Let's write these for more. And so whether it's Moonraker or Octopussy, they really used his style. The almost aggravating banter he has with villains. It wasn't, you know, a diabolical, maniacal thing. It was, he would get under the villain's skin because, you know what, he wouldn't take it too seriously. And that pissed off the villains.
You missed, Mr. Bond. Did I? As you said, such good sport.
I think that really got the audience more involved with him. I felt, and Roger Moore's my Bond. I grew up with him. So my James Bond with a pithy, campy, get under your skin type moment. So it probably made me a more obnoxious child and trying to get under my teacher's skin. So that was the pattern that we held during the Roger Moore era. And I think it's one that happily we may go back to, where it's a little bit more fun and glib and campy. And I welcome that with open arms.
From his first moment on screen to frankly his last in View to a Kill, he was James Bond. And off screen, he was exactly like he was on screen, immaculately dressed. His hair always perfect, even if he just come out of the water or an airplane without a parachute. And incredibly gentle, incredibly kind to others, incredibly polite. Roger Moore was called by friends and loved ones what is known in the business as even featured. We all think of ourselves as not perfect, as asymmetrical. One always has one breast larger than the other, or one knee that's a little dimpled, or one eyebrow that's a little raised, like Roger's. But Roger's face was purely symmetrical. He was one of the most handsome men that Britain in the modern era has produced. So he's known for being a handsome person who is also very modest. And the other thing that makes him stand out, other than just, wow, he's glamorous, and he's wearing these amazing clothes. We look at the clothes now, we think, oh, this is the 1970s, 1980s. Those clothes were the finest clothes you could possibly wear, these gorgeous clothes. What made him stand out was that Roger Moore is a very underrated actor because he constantly put his own acting down. He would constantly make jokes about what he was doing and how he did it. He'd say, I made more money with a raised eyebrow than anybody else. But if you watch him in other features, he's incredible. He does villainy, he does scary horror films. He even imitated Peter Sellers perfectly as Inspector Clouseau. For 5 minutes on the screen in one long take, he's Inspector Clouseau, and he's pitch perfect to the Peter Sellers character. Roger Moore is a phenomenal actor. I'd say the most underrated actor of the Bond.
During Roger Moore's time as Bond, a lot happened behind the scenes. In 1975, for instance, Harry Saltzman had sold his 50% share of the holding company Danjaq to United Artists, but he sold it too cheaply. It's a mistake he regretted for a very long time, probably for the rest of his life. And with United Artists now the sole distributor, Albert R. Broccoli had a huge corporate business partner breathing down his neck through the entire Roger Moore era and possibly beyond. And after Roger Moore retired from the role, they looked for actor number 4 to portray 007. Pierce Brosnan also screen tested for the role, but he was tied down with the American TV series Remington Steele, and he couldn't get out of that. Timothy Dalton had been considered for Bond before, and upon the suggestion of Broccoli's wife, Dana, they tested him again. He gave it a lot of thought and agreed, bringing along his own vision of how Bond should be like, and it was different in any way imaginable.
I like the seriousness of his portrayal, I must say, because this was the phase when I was reading the novels, and it seemed to me his portrayal seemed to me to align itself with the portrayal that Ian Fleming had of James Bond in the novels. That kind of seemed very appropriate, seemed very natural.
Just in his looks and his manner, in the way he just kind of wears his clothes with this stain. He wears the same Brioni and Tom Ford that others wear, but he wears it more like it's not important, just like Fleming wore his clothes. He's the book Bond, that we all know. Let me tell you a few things you may not know. The original print of The Living Daylights, the ultra-rare print, got away from the studio. He had the same kind of angry voice he used in License to Kill. As in, I want that busted Sanchez, where he's kind of just, because he read Casino Royale, he said it was a freaking great first novel by an author, and then he read the rest of the Flemings, and he said Bond, and I don't agree with him, but Bond is angry. Bond is repressed. Bond is that Britisher who lives inside all Britishers, who wants to punch the next man in the street and has to be very British and just kind of hold it all in. He's seething with rage. So he is prescient to Danny Craig's Bond in that he's a Britisher who has some energy, some power, and he wants to lash out. I mean, he picked that up from the Flemings. That's what he took from the Flemings. So it wasn't too early. It was the right time for a violent, darker Bond.
If you watch interviews before he started The Living Daylights, he literally says that he went back to Fleming. And he wanted this to be Fleming's Bond. He's smoking in it. He wanted to be, a certain harshness. So even the one-liners that they gave him in The Living Daylights, some of them work, some of them don't work, because he's trying to play that serious Bond. Can you have a serious Bond do one-liners and have shtick, as I call it? They tend to fight against each other, and that's the problem I think people have with Dalton's films. They didn't know quite what to make of it. Are you trying to be serious and spy and intrigue, and is it Fleming-esque? Or are you still trying to add camp and humor and one-liners? And where does that fall?
A beautifully made film with that wonderful John Barry score, great visuals, a lot of fun, and a very interesting heroine, probably the most interesting heroine ever in a Bond film, Cara Mallovi. Why? She's conflicted, she has different allegiances, and again, sort of taken from Fleming. So great stuff there.
I like Bond to be a little bit like an action hero. I like him to be a little bit like, almost like a Superman figure. But Dalton's realistic approach, I could do really well. I really love both of his movies.
When I went to see Living Daylights in the cinema in the Odeon in Chester, in England, just outside Wales, I live in Wales. And I saw the 25th anniversary of James Bond on this big screen, and it was Living Daylights. It was really good because on the stage they brought in all the different Bond girls, local models, I guess, were dressed up as Dr. No, representing Dr. No, Diamonds Are Forever and stuff like that. And they all came on the stage and, in the cinema. It was really good. And they really put the effort into promoting The Living Daylights in just a normal cinema. They put on a bit of a show, there's a bit of, not just, give us your money, watch the movie, which, a lot of cinema filmmakers do. Obviously it is.
The feeling you're left with after one of those Bond films is melancholy. As the end credits play and the music goes on, you're like, I wish I was there. I wish I was at the concert. I wish I was in Bratislava. I wish I was on the boat with Octopussy. I wish I could see India. I miss this, and I can't wait 2 more years for another film. And you're left with a sense that you had an adventure. The skies have been sunny, the exotic locations, Europe is beautiful, people are interesting. So Living Daylights also wraps it up for me as well. And filmmakers have taken a different tack, and they'll recast Bond again, right? So.
And then, of course, he was, especially in License to Kill, put into, Miami Vice-like moments. Maybe even the way things were shot, the film stock didn't feel that that richness of the 60s Bond, and certainly even the 70s Bonds. And then to boot, the License to Kill as a storyline is a bit depressing. I mean, his friend getting his leg eaten off and pieces like that. I mean, it's pretty serious stuff for a Bond film. So looking to escape? Well, welcome back to the world of drugs. It doesn't really create that escapism that I look for.
They tried to do something different. They said, you know what? This isn't your father's or your grandfather's Bond. Let's have some fun with it. Let's do something different. Let's give him a reason. Ian Fleming wouldn't have done it. In Ian Fleming's Live and Let Die, when Bond finds out Felix Leiter's been bangled by a shark, he visits him, then he goes off to the mission. When he finds out that Solitaire has been kidnapped by Mr. Big, he goes off to the mission. He would never do anything but go to Istanbul for the next mission, as M warned him about in License to Kill. So a departure from Fleming, but an exciting film that gives us something to think about. And what makes a great film, a great Bond film? I don't think anyone would argue with us. You need a great villain. And Franz Sanchez owns his own country, his own president, his own army, his own colonel, his own missiles, his own casino, and so on. So he's a very exciting villain.
He actually loses his license, where he actually makes that cut and sort of says, okay, I'm going to go out on my own. This is more important than the job. And that seemed completely believable to me.
This private vendetta of yours could easily compromise Her Majesty's government. You have an assignment, and I expect you to carry it out objectively and professionally.
Then you have my resignation, sir.
In that movie, you really see the toughness of Timothy Dalton as James Bond, even more than in Daylights. That's what I really like. He has to do it on his own. He gets help from, again, a beautiful Bond girl, Pam Bouvier. They get it done. And she can do things. She kicks ass in the bar when he meets her for the first time, when she still has the curly hair.
Why don't we go outside and we talk in private?
Take your hands off her. She's with me.
Nobody's asking you, gringo.
He's with me. Keep your hands on the table.
One thing that shocked me a bit because of its brutality was the death scene in the vacuum chamber, or whatever you might call that. Because that was very, very graphic. And of course, the way that Felix Leiter dies is horrible. So it did become very gory. But in that way, I think they were ahead of their time in that way. But of course, it was a shame because people didn't really go for it. But those scenes stuck in my mind, I can remember, because they hadn't been part of a James Bond film in all their graphicness before.
It's a great film, and I cannot get it why that film is so underrated, because it's a good one, you know. It has a nice soundtrack. I really like the song from Gladys Knight. It's absolutely a shame that Dalton did not get the chance to make another Bond film.
It was a precursor to Craig, as I've appreciated things like Quantum of Solace a little bit more, where it's not this larger-than-life Moonraker story. I've now revisited Timothy Dalton, and he's gone up 1, possibly 2 notches in my appreciation.
I think Tim Dalton was the right guy at the right time. I would have loved to have seen him do 12 Bond films. I don't know if other people would agree, but I thought he was great.
In late 1988, while filming License to Kill, Timothy Dalton said, "I have the feeling this will be the last one." Meaning, the last film of the franchise altogether. And everything really seemed to point in that direction, because then there came the big gap. There would be no new Bond film for 6 years. And the reason behind this would go beyond the scope of this documentary, and many publications have been written about it. So, in short, control of the franchise and Eon Productions was handed over from Cubby Broccoli to his daughter, Barbara, and her half-brother, Michael G. Wilson. That happened in August 1990. Timothy Dalton's contract to play Bond expired in 1993, and although Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson wanted him to continue, distributors MGM and United Artists sought fresh blood to attract a new audience. And So Dalton received the phone call you don't want to receive, ending his time as 007, sadly. And United Artists was pushing for Pierce Brosnan. And following the cancellation of his TV series Remington Steele, he was not only free, but also available for a long-term contract. So he didn't even have to do a screen test, since they had already done that before Timothy Dalton got the part. And at the decisive meeting, Cubby Broccoli was still present, and he made this legendary final decision. We should go with Pierce. And so they did.
In my house, we all jumped up, like literally jumped out of our seats and were jumping up and down the day they announced that Pierce was finally going to be Bond.
I liked him in Remington Steele, and I was really happy when they announced that he would be the next James Bond. I thought that would be very fitting, and I think that he did a really good job.
I remember what it was like when GoldenEye came out. The excitement was palpable. I was treated to a sneak preview. I saw about 12 minutes of the film before it came out through an Eon source, and I said, this is going to be big. And moreover, if we can remember, Pierce Brosnan was hired for Living Daylights. He went to the set with John Glenn. So it was so exciting that Pierce was finally going to get this role. We were waiting 6 more years, actually 8 more years for Pierce to get the role. People were excited. And from the opening scene, he jumps off into the dam and everyone's excited and cheering. It was great.
Brosnan is an excellent choice as James Bond. He has it all. He is my favorite James Bond. And that is the case because I'm from 1983, and I was, how old was I? 12 years old when GoldenEye came out. I did see a GoldenEye when I was in school, and I really loved it. I loved the whole atmosphere. It's a classic, good, bad story. It's East against West. Where have we heard that before? Many times. But it was well executed.
When you say James Bond, I think of Pierce Brosnan because he, for me, was the quintessential James Bond. Of course, partially it has to do with the fact that I grew up with him as James Bond and I got to love him as James Bond. But everything, the attitude, the face, the stance, the stride, the walk, the way he talks, the way he behaves, he's just the quintessential gentleman for me. And the quintessential British spy for me, so that's why he, for me, was the perfect cast for doing the James Bond movies.
When I saw GoldenEye in the cinema, I think I went to see that several times, and just the first time that I went to see it, just that reaction in the pre-title sequence when he dives after the plane and of course makes it into the cockpit, and the whole audience gasped and then laughed because of course he managed it. It was just such a lovely moment that after this long wait, the whole cinema was relieved that we've got a James Bond again, and I thought that was a very good entry for him.
I think GoldenEye was a great movie. He had a great director, a director who understood Bond, a director who knew how to bring Bond and wipe off the cobwebs and reinvent him, but still keep the wonderful tropes that he has. I think both of them, director and Brosnan, knew how to handle their leading ladies and give them the spotlight and the villainesses and the villain and play off of them incredibly well.
You don't need the gun, Commander.
That depends on your definition of safe sex.
She kills it, absolutely. Famke Janssen is on her top. Really love that. She's an absolute brilliant villain, killing people with her thighs. It's wonderful. You can edit that in.
The whole tone of the James Bond movies suddenly changed. Again, GoldenEye, of course, being one of those movies, was very dark, gritty, very sort of down to earth, with a few possible exceptions. They went a completely different way also with the score by Eric Serra, which was something completely different. You've never heard it before, and you never heard it ever since.
People say, oh, glasnost, and the Cold War's over. Meanwhile, we have a political issue right now while we're taping. Russia has invaded Ukraine, a sovereign nation, and it touches on NATO. The Cold War never left. It just got more discreet, as friends can tell you from CIA and so on.
Nowadays, many people, in hindsight, they say the Pierce Brosnan era was not sort of the best era for James Bond, but I beg to differ because I think completely otherwise. To me, the Pierce Brosnan Bond films were among the best in the whole series.
People say, well, From Russia with Love is the greatest Bond film. It's not my favorite. And others say it's slow, it's an old film, and I can't watch Dr. No, and I'm bored with Goldfinger, and I love Skyfall, and I hate Skyfall. You will never find a Bond fan who doesn't rate GoldenEye very highly, because it has just enough dark and just enough Cold War, as you said, and all the other wonderful elements in a great Pierce Brosnan. So these were great times, but Eon has to be very, very careful about making something too close to reality.
I'm invincible! This is so key.
What's interesting about placing a film with the times is that Eon takes a tremendous risk. Think about it. Had they made Tomorrow Never Dies more about the Hong Kong exchange, Hong Kong moving from Britain to sovereign to China over time, right? Had they made the film and set it there, and said, we'll be right on the money. If the takeover was peaceful, they might seem like they were being campy or silly. And if the takeover was violent, people would associate Tomorrow Never Dies with the violence. So unfortunately, whereas Fleming had more freedom, the Bond movie people have to be somewhat timely, but not really. But Tomorrow Never Dies, as you know, takes its cue from a media mogul. It's a fun film, it's exciting, and it's about a theme that gets picked up in Spectre and No Time to Die, that the true villain controls information.
The internet was coming up. It was 1997. I can remember that we had a phone line, and then you could call in on your modem, and you heard those sounds, and then you heard your mom screaming upstairs, Jorrit, I cannot use the phone, please stop internet, And then they made a film about the internet, about media, about the possibility to completely alter with media.
I love Tomorrow Never Dies. I will fight it tooth and nail against anybody that says anything other. I love the action, the overtop. Do I think Jonathan Pryce is the best villain in the world? No. Do I fault it for that? No. I forgive it for that.
Many people say that it's a flawed movie, but not to me. To me, again, it's perfect popcorn cinema at its best, with so many key moments. I can't even start to mention them.
Brosnan himself wanted to stretch the limits. It was his idea, make Terry Hatcher my former girlfriend. And it might not have been Terry Hatcher, right? It could have been somebody else who came along in Spectre. But it was Pierce's idea, let's give it more gravitas, let's give it more thoughts. Where Pierce got distracted is he was trying to channel Connery and Moore and Lazenby, as he said, and Dalton. He would meet fans who were raving fans for George Lazenby and trying to inject that in his performance. And Pierce is a wonderful character actor, and unfortunately he's often a leading man because he's also very handsome like Roger Moore, but we see him best as a villain. So had they gone a little bit darker, it might have really played. Or had they used some of the incredible stunts and thoughts and concepts.
Living in Germany, I just enjoyed the fact that Tomorrow Never Dies was partly shot in Germany and set in Germany. So that was amusing for him to talk to the car in German and stuff like that. So that was interesting.
This whole adventure with James Bond started back in 1997 when I had the opportunity to play GoldenEye for the first time. It was virtually everywhere, everyone was playing it, my brothers, my classmates, my cousins were playing the game, and of course I was playing the game. I learned that it was a creation by Ian Fleming and that he had written like 13 books and 2 short story collections, and that there were several movies at the time, and many different characters, and good-looking girls, fast cars, and excellent music. So I was obviously more interested and invested on learning about the character.
Moving into the world is not enough. They brought back a nearly From Russia with Love type moment where you had intrigue and betrayal and turns and, what's this? A Bond villainess at the key core of everything? That's a new moment. And Bond killing a woman in cold blood, some very dark new things. So I think Brosnan's outing, especially in that film, was something that we were able to explore as a darkness that we couldn't quite explore before.
I was excited that they wanted to again play with the formula while still giving us some of the formula we all enjoy as fans.
That was the movie when I became a Bond fan, a Bond fanatic. Seeing the Thames boat chase, which was the longest pre-title sequence until No Time to Die, that was shown. It has everything. When you're going to think about the effort that the crew and the cast did go through making that sequence, it was 3 or 5 weeks that they filmed. Is there any other film that you recall that films in front of the Houses of Parliament at that low, vulnerable location with so much action, so muchly done, Bond open doors, you know, and they absolutely nailed it in that sequence.
It Was Not Enough was the first movie that I actually saw in cinema, which was the defining moment that made me a Bond fan, because, and I remember as of today, so vividly these scenes of the chase on the River Thames. Again, a movie that I absolutely love. Watched about 100 to 200 times. Still get a kick out of it every time I watch it again.
I think the most cringe-worthy scene is also a Pierce Brosnan with that one-liner about Christmas. And you kind of think, okay. And it was unfortunate that sort of Pierce Brosnan kind of left the whole scene, the James Bond scene, with that one-liner. You kind of think, okay, couldn't you have done something else?
And then we have the last Brosnan film, Die Another Day, also better known as Buy Another Day, because that film is absolutely godsmacked with product placement. Everything that you see, from the lipstick from Halle Berry as Jinx, to the cigars, to everything else, Smirnoff, everything is a product placement and sponsored. But it's okay, because, yeah, why not? That's Bond. Bond is product placement, and without product placement, there is no Bond film.
Die Another Day was totally over the top in so many ways, in terms of the plot, in terms of the villain, in terms of the song.
I know many fans hate Die Another Day. They can't stand that film. And they talk about the curse of the first hour. You may have heard of this, where they love the first hour of Moonraker, and they love the first hour of Tomorrow Never Dies. And exactly around the 60-minute mark, something, I enjoy Die Another Day. I love the Ice Palace. It's a spectacular concept that's worthy of a James Bond film, that adheres to Cubby Broccoli's formula of make the film big and have a big explosion and then make it bigger and have it go on. And so with both Die Another Day and World Is Not Enough, they try to give you backstory and intrigue and drama, and Renard is angry and he's personally upset, and Bond is injured, and Bond's in pain, and Bond is mad at Elektra, and something's going on with Gustav Grabs, and he doesn't trust. There's all kinds of things that we can enjoy as fans.
I think that, we faulted for some weakness in direction and ending, but I still think Brosnan brought the excitement back, the sexiness back of everything we've come to know and love in Bond.
The story I find very interesting with that identity and DNA transformation and so on, which is, I think, quite an interesting idea to do. And again, very well executed with many memorable scenes. I love all the scenes when Bond is basically being put out of MI6. Then you get that feel of what is he going to do now, and then he has to go back in. Of course, some people they talk smack about the movie because of the invisible car, because of the bad CGI, but that's just minor things to me that don't bother me at all. It's still a movie that I also, again, just rewatched recently, and I just enjoyed so thoroughly. It's just a fantastic movie.
The fans had asked for more M, more Q, more gadgets, more humor. That's what they got. Well, we have them all in loads in Die Another Day, and World Is Not Enough. So why complain? It's what the fans wanted.
Brosnan brought style back. Timothy Dalton may have let it wane. Roger Moore in his last 2 outings, certainly. But from a style standpoint, Bond was back. Look at that. The guy looks like a model, and he wears his Brioni suits perfectly. Do I want to be like that? You know what? I think I do. And it was Brosnan that woke up the senses within me personally as a young executive to dress better, to wear suits that fit me and shoes that maybe would cost a little bit extra, but gosh, if they're worth it to Bond, maybe they're worth it to me. And I think he brought a whole generation into understanding what does Bond style mean. Some of the takeaways with Brosnan is I think he got some great movies, and I think he got some lesser movies.
I don't think there were many mistakes made during Pierce Brosnan's era. They're wonderful films, and 40 years from now, people will enjoy them.
It was 2004, 2 years after Die Another Day was in cinemas, that Pierce Brosnan received a call from his agent telling him that negotiations on his fifth Bond film had stopped, actually. And a few days after that, Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson called him. Barbara crying on the phone, and Michael just telling him, Pierce, you've been a great James Bond, thank you. And that was it. Apparently, Brosnan had demanded too much money for another film, something that he claims to be untrue, so this still needs verification. He still wanted to do another film because he thought his tenure was unfinished business. There was still something to be done. And then financial trouble with distributor MGM led to this $5 billion takeover by Sony, thus gaining the distribution rights and injecting fresh money into making the Bond films. But selling Sony the idea to make Casino Royale had not been an easy task for Barbara Broccoli, but finding the right actor to steer the series through a reboot was, apparently. She was shown Daniel Craig in Layer Cake and reportedly said, I'm in love with Daniel Craig. He's going to be our next Bond. However, Craig was reluctant and highly skeptical. But the same applied to the audience when he was announced as the new James Bond. And looking back on it nowadays, we have found a word for that. Shitstorm.
I, like many people, had major doubts. I didn't know who this new guy was. I remember when they had him, in the boat coming to do, the big press release and the opening. And, to me, I was coming off of Brosnan, this tall drink of water that looked like a model and suave and debonair, knew how to say everything to the press. And here was Daniel Craig kind of moving through the motions. So even up to the point of seeing the movie, I had my doubts. And of course, today, Casino Royale is my favorite Bond film because it delivered everything to me. It delivered those, rough moments, a new action Bond, so to speak. But I also love the connection with all of the other characters in the story. I love the locations that he went to, and the plot and the story were perfect.
The choice for Daniel Craig was also a bit controversial, for sure. Because, Bond is a character with black hair. But that's not always the case, because Roger Moore had brown hair. Okay. And he did 7 James Bond films. But Craig was blonde. And that was a thing that not many people... There were people that did not like that. I digged a bit into that thread, into that story, and it was the most of those people were Pierce Brosnan lovers and didn't like Craig as the new Bond because they thought that Pierce Brosnan had to make 1 or 2 more movies. But I think that they made the right decision. They took the right decision. They took a relatively young actor, unknown, to play their Bond. And I think that we can all say that it worked out perfectly.
There are many places where the film took many more chances than they ever had since 1962. We all know what they are. And so it was an exciting departure. And to me, it's not a reboot in terms of, in the novel Casino Royale, or Casino Royale, James Bond is an older agent who's been fighting since World War II. He's in his maybe 33, 34 years old. And he's already learned cards. That's why he's been assigned to tackle his chief at cards. So Casino Royale was not a reboot. As Fleming, it was an already established character from the first page, the first novel, first paragraph, of the film. So to me, I don't watch it and say, oh, it's a reboot. I watch it and I say, they want to give us permission to break character in exciting ways.
I find that he's similar in the way he approached Bond as Sean Connery, because you believe that he's ready to pounce on the villain or the henchman, and even if the villain or the henchman is not going to attack him, he's going to attack him first. So there's going to be some kind of a confrontation. He's like a spring that's ready to just, or a coil that's just ready to spring.
It's not that he's running. It's not that he takes the crane, the construction thing, and demolishes the construction site, and he's throwing his gun at Malaka and he's punching him in the face. He's running. It's when he runs through the drywall, and in the theaters, big laugh. Like, whoa! And I just sat there and I thought, okay, this is different. It's not just different from Pierce or Roger playing a lighter Bond or a more sophisticated Bond or a campier or funnier Bond. That was different than anything Sean Connery ever did. It really was. So they moved Bond, I would say like this, from an action hero of the past since medieval times, almost like an archetype. They moved from a hero who wins the girl and defeats the villain and has delicious food and delicious drink and has an adventure, to an action hero like Schwarzenegger or Bruce Willis who gets his body battered. Instead of Bond having his ego battered or his food battered and eating battered food, he has his body broken to accomplish the mission.
He is vulnerable, and I've talked to several friends of mine, female friends of mine, and that's what they, even if they're not Bond fans, that's what they appreciate of the portrayal that Daniel Craig has, that there's another side, a more vulnerable side that is maybe more realistic and doesn't make the character as slick, and it doesn't make you think that everything's just gonna run off this character like water off a duck's back and he's gonna come out unscathed and okay, off to the next adventure, but that whatever happens actually leaves some scars and leaves some maybe visible scars and invisible scars.
He's sitting in a shower with a woman. He feels her death. You see the pain and anguish on his face when he can't revive her. Is this the Bond of Sean Connery that kind of walks away with a glib moment? No.
That's what a lot of my female friends find attractive about his portrayal, and I must admit, so do I.
It's different. What I mean by different? Vesper Lynd's suicide. Again, straight from Fleming. So when people say, I love Casino Royale 2006, I say, you also love Ian Fleming, because a lot of the things that drive you on the film.
The way Daniel Craig always tries to crack a joke, even though his interpretation is different, it is always nice to see him try to crack a joke, which is nice, which fits in the formula.
I find in the Daniel Craig era, the one-liners became cleverer. I love that scene where Javier Bardem and Daniel Craig have this scene in Skyfall where it's sort of homoerotic, and he sort of says, what makes you think it's my first time? I love the fact that they play with his male persona and his male image. And I find in that way they become clever. And because I'm a teacher, my favorite one-liner is, we're teachers on sabbatical and we've just won the lottery, so.
It really rounded out very nicely. So as we move through this, I think Daniel Craig as a Bond was able to deliver all of those things increasingly. Better style, more rough and tumble, fallible and relatable.
I was taking my son to see Skyfall. I'd already seen it at a special premiere. And I said to him, you know, and this was the first Bond film he was seeing in the theaters, not on TV. He'd seen all the rest on television. I said, you know, this film is very different. Skyfall is uniquely, there's a lot of different things they've done. And my son, I'll never forget it, is sitting next to me in the car and he says, what, does he travel in time? And I turned to look at him and I just gave him a glare and a look and I didn't say a word. And he said, he's traveling in time? And then when the film shows up and Bond takes out his Aston Martin, he's getting rid of M's car, which is noticed, so he can sneak away to Scotland. M says, where are we going? He opens the vintage Aston Martin and he says, as we know, back in time. And you should have seen the look on Benjamin's face, my son's face. So I don't care what Bond does. I just care that they're taking 5 and 6 years to make these films.
I know.
I must admit, when I was sitting in the cinema, I kind of thought, at about 2 points in the film, I thought, are they really going to do this? No, they're not going to do this. Are they really? Yeah, they're going to do this. And I left the cinema gobsmacked, I must say, but I thought, wow, and I was really impressed, and I take my hat off to them for having the guts to do that, because it's something different. It takes courage to do this.
Fans hate it the first time they see No Time to Die, and then on subsequent viewings it's a little more palatable because they're over the initial shock. But as I'm watching the last 20 minutes of the film and he's taking more wounds and there's more people leaving the island, I'm like, uh-oh, here it comes. He's not going to escape from this explosion. He's not going to swim to the submarine. I was okay with it, but I was sad. And any Bond fan is sad, even when their fictional character dies. And you know at the end of the end credits, it says the 4 magic words, James Bond will return. So I understand fans being sad. And this was a different kind of sadness than On Her Majesty's Secret Service. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the hero is now unmarried again and gets to go off again, just like in the Fleming novel. This was something really provocative. I would say fans would also like No Time to Die more had the ending gone a little differently.
Gut-wrenching. You know, that whole idea of like all your excitement is suddenly neutralized. It's stopped, and then you're gutted. And then you have doubts. You know, you feel like Charlie Brown with Lucy and the football pulling it out from underneath you. I will tell you, that is the first few times things got delayed, I felt like that. I really felt like there was a gap and something was missing. But I've transformed. And now I've come to not rely on a movie. I don't look at the events that we do or the times that we have or some of the content that we create as content creators now beholden to a movie. My joy of Bond is not beholden to a movie anymore because I've had to, over a year and a half or more, walk away from that. That's not where I'm going to get my fix. It's from the Bond community.
Fleming had Bond drop dead to the floor in From Russia with Love, but even before From Russia with Love was printed, he had drafted Dr. No. And he was the master of cliffhangers, and he said, end every chapter with a cliffhanger. So he ended the 5th James Bond novel with James Bond dead on the floor from poison. Wonderful, ambiguous. People wrote him letters. No Time to Die was not ambiguous. I had predicted Bond's death. I said, this is the first film in history. They know the actor's not going to stay on. They know this. They left it ambiguous in Spectre. Oh, what do you mean when he tossed his gun? When he tossed his gun, fans don't always understand. He was showing Madeline Swan he could not be, he could be a man of peace and put away the violence. And on the other side, because Sam Mendes uses all these doubles, we have Dr. Swan here, we have M here. He's showing M, I respect the fact that we're going to incarcerate Blofeld and interrogate him. I've matured since Quantum of Solace when I killed all my leads, right? As M jokes about. So at Spectre, we know he goes off into the sunset because he might have had his last film. But he has like Brosnan and more 4 or 5 contracts. So he has to do 4 films. The 5th one's called a 2A option, meaning the star or the producers could say no. They said no to Brosnan, as we know, for a 5th. They said yes to Danny for No Time to Die. So for several years, I had told anyone who'd listen, they're going to kill him. So when I'm watching it, I was very prepared.
My first impression hasn't changed. I still admire the fact that that's the way they went and that's the way they told the story. And I found it and still find it just exciting and fresh and something different, you know? They'll have to find a way to get themselves out of the corner, maybe. I don't know whether they've maneuvered themselves into a corner. You could also argue that. But it also leaves a completely fresh, clean slate for anybody to come after that.
It's unbelievable that Bond has been able to captivate audiences around the globe for 60 years now. And sometimes I wonder if Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman are looking down on the whole extravaganza from the heavens and thinking, yes, we gave the world something truly fantastic in our time. Something people will look up to. Something to take them out of their busy lives for a couple of hours. What they started in 1962 with putting everything on one card and just giving it a go had a massive global impact, touching all our lives in so many different ways. It's incredible.
Bond of the first decade, you know, we had this almost untouchable superhero. You know, he wasn't a very, I'll say this, he wasn't a very vulnerable anti-hero. He was an anti-hero. He was fallible. You know, he used women as dispensable playthings, as opposed to meaningful pursuits. And then in the following decade, you had this rise. And the rise was not just about a more fallible hero, but something a little bit different. You know, with Roger Moore, for example, you had somebody that decided to embed humor. And it was okay to be funny. It was okay to look at adversity and adventure and threats and have a little one-liner. It was a certain campiness that people look back to in both the costume and the hero himself. But I think it's what we needed at the time. And that's what I think the Bond franchise does. It takes every decade, and I think the franchise owners sit back and they go, you know what? What do we need? What do we need collectively right now to escape the political, the religious, the geopolitical strife that we're in here? And that's what they embedded. You know, if you put Dalton and Brosnan in sort of kind of a decade to their own, you walk away with something even totally different, which is to this whole idea of a certain amount of danger and what I would call a wonderful combination. You've got, in Brosnan, for example, I think you've got the best of Connery and you've got the pithiness of Roger Moore. And with Dalton, you've got this mash of Fleming. So I think it was this wonderful puzzle piece put together. And then, of course, you have, you know, what we're kind of living right now, Daniel Craig. And suddenly they've given him, what's that? Vulnerability. But it's what we needed right now. It was somebody that was a little bit more, I'll use this word, relatable.
There seemed to be a code in Bond's world. And there was a certain amount of class and a certain amount of elegance and a whole lot of intelligence. Even if ultimately the villain does something really stupid in the end and Bond's able to take advantage of that, there's an intelligence all around it that was very attractive to me too. And the class that, yeah, you had these car chases and you had things blowing up, but there were also these great conversations that went on between Bond and his allies, or Bond and the villain. These moments of intellectual tension around the Baccarat table or one of the party scenes. There were different ways to communicate tension and aggression without it ever having to really be violent. And I appreciated that, and I really respected that, and I liked that a lot.
There is so many things that can be associated with him, and especially these influences, and then the things that he's also influenced, like other spy genres, spy films, TV series, anything like that, and then real world stuff, with all the gadgets and stuff like that.
You shouldn't consider Bond a role model, but everything that surrounds him is so classy, so cosmopolitan, so nice, so exciting, so interesting. And I think that the music captures the essence of that, no matter if it's a John Barry score from the 60s or a David Arnold score for the 90s or early 2000s. It brings this Bond world to your place, to your ears, and you feel immersed in this world of espionage and danger and fast cars and beautiful girls.
Love all the action, I love all the set pieces. I do appreciate each of the 6 Bonds. I love the music and theme songs that they have at the start of the films. I'm just very glad that this franchise clicked with me. I love being a Bond fan, and I have, ever since then, have gone beyond the movies. I've started reading the books, I've played the video games. I got that Lego set of the Aston Martin DB5. I'm just all around happy to be a Bond fan.
As a woman, I wanted to make sure that all of my friends who were female had a space that they could come and talk about James Bond too. And that's what I tried to bring to CommanderBond.net for the 3 or 4 years that I was there and working as a moderator, was to give space to people to express their fandom through informal criticism, through fan fiction, through fan art. This was 2002, 2003, 2004. All of that was still very new. The internet was relatively still very new. We were just really beginning to understand how we could come together as a fan community And I wanted to create spaces for people to express themselves creatively. And I hope, and I know that's what Commander Bond did, and MI6 UK, and absolutely James Bond. And I would like to hope that I was a small part of helping people be fans by keeping those websites going.
Guy Hamilton said, with James Bond we get more from life than it offers by itself. For me, exactly that is it. And now we can celebrate the 60th anniversary of Bond movies. And of course I am proud to be a part of this great Bond community. It's like a big family.
I love the whole classic series from Dr. No to License to Kill. I don't feel like choosing only one movie or just a few. He doesn't drink beer, but always champagne or vodka martini. He doesn't bleed or sweat. He's always well dressed, clean, and absolutely handsome. A real charming gentleman, like the great Sir Roger Moore. From the 60s to the 80s, every other action movie imitated Bond. But later, sometime, it's the opposite, and the franchise is no more a benchmark.
Probably it sounds like I am exaggerating, but most of the decisions I have made in leisure and profession have been oriented towards having a touch to this fantastic world that James Bond brings in his adventures, in his stories, in this wonderful universe created by Fleming. So that's it. I am a James Bond fan, and I expect to continue being a James Bond fan until the end of my days.
Any film is a team effort, and especially if it's been a film series that spanned 60 years and so many trends and ups and downs. And can you imagine Dr. No or You Only Live Twice without the Ken Adam production sets? Can you imagine them without the John Barry music? You know, it very much hinges also on the main actor, because I mean it's a James Bond film. It's not without reason that every time a new actor is announced that it's a huge item in the news, you know. So the James Bond actor definitely shapes the period they take over the role for, but it's just so much of a group effort that I would be hard pressed to pin it down to one person, really.
On screen, it's the costume designers, it's the editors, it's the wonderful special effects boffins, it's the director. Terrence Young directed with a champagne glass in his hand, and he said in Thunderball when they had to reenact the Junkanoo, "This is a fine set, but the champagne is warm."
James Bond for 60 years has been a global phenomenon. People on every freaking continent, including Antarctica, watch his movies. He is a hero to all of us. He inspires us, all of us, male and female, to be a version of ourselves that's a little more suave, a little more classy, a little more intellectual, to use our brains, not just our brawn. And I really hope that hopefully we can find a way to be more inclusive. I know everyone hates that word inclusive, but I'm really hoping we can remember that he's for all of us, and he's the hero for all of us, and he gives us that escape in our darkest moments. World terrorism, global pandemics, that he's the guy that is going to see us through and will help keep us safe and give us the space to follow along.
I'd say one of the most fascinating aspects of the Bond franchise is its endurance. Times have changed constantly. Actors have changed, plots, politics, and you think, what potential is still in there? How long can it still go on?
My mother grew up in London, and she'd sort of tell me stories about going to see Goldfinger in Leicester Square and stuff like that. So she sort of told me about this background a little bit, and she was also a fan when she was growing up and the first films came out. I find it absolutely impressive that there is this long-running series of films, and that it's basically been in the hands of the same group of people over this long period of time. I'm very impressed with how they have the finger on the pulse of what is troubling society, what geopolitically is going on in the world. That's kind of what helps them remain relevant, that they're up to date and that they really reflect the zeitgeist. And of course, it's the classic story of good versus evil, and good prevails and the hero prevails, which of course is a bit of a problem at the end of the most recent movie, because the hero doesn't prevail, but that's a different story, I guess.
The fact that we can be catapulted from a relatively mundane moment or a stressful moment in our workday, or a moment that we don't quite know how to handle, and suddenly you're within Bond's realm and he knows exactly what to do. He has excitement. He has near death. Life is about excitement in his world, and I think that's something that has maintained through all of these 60 years. And to me, that's what really drew me in around the Daniel Craig time of, you know what, I can kind of live my life like Bond, of course, leaving out the assassinations and misogynistic attitude. I put that to the left of me.
One thing that always is said when a new actor comes onto the scene, we go back to the original, we go back to Ian Fleming, let's do a reboot, let's go back to the roots. And the question is, how often can they do that, and how much material is there still left in the roots in Ian Fleming? Maybe you can take single scenes or single items like that garden that they used in in No Time to Die in the last film. It won't be another reboot like they did with Casino Royale, because of course they haven't got another book to film completely, or one that would be believable in our time or not dated anymore.
People love Bond. We're going to have Bond 60 years from now, but the media is wrong, and they keep showing images of actors who in their facial features and their body type resemble Danny Craig, worked out for the Bond films, and I think they're going to reboot to a slimmer Timothy Dalton kind of look and do and just return to classic Bond. They've reached a point with No Time to Die where they can't keep doing what they're doing. Just like they changed from the glamour of Moonraker to the action of Fear Eyes Only, and the over-the-top Die Another Day to the down-to-earth Casino Royale, they'll change again, and they're going to cast a younger person. I've been predicting that for years. Barbara Broccoli said this week, it's a decade's commitment. 4 films is 10 years. So they have to cast a younger person. They're not going to cast a Henry Cavill. They're not going to cast an Idris Elba or Tom Hardy. It's not going to happen. It has to be someone in their 30s. I would also predict there'll be a man and not a woman, for the simple reason, most simple reason, the majority of film buyers, ticket buyers, DVD buyers are men with their partners and girlfriends and children. And would I balk at seeing a female James Bond? I would go and see it. I wouldn't balk at it. And it's been about 60 years since they've really done Ian Fleming. I think they could do a Bond film in the 60s. I think the question nobody asks is, and then what cool stunts will they do that you believe? What cool machines will be driven? What cool gadgets will they have? Oh, look, Bond, here's a pencil that's also a pen. So you're going to lose a lot when you go to the 60s. But I will go to see the film even if he jumps into a time travel machine. Let's have films made every year. 62, 63, 64, 65. That I can live with.
James Bond is not simply entertainment to us fans. It's a lifelong friendship. Yes, it's fiction and it's over the top and often comical or disappointing for various reasons, but it's one hell of a ride every time. Personally, I don't want to get off this ride. I don't want this ride to end, ever.
When you watch a Bond film, you forget the real world because he transports you to a version of the real world that is a bit bigger, a bit more exciting, a bit more magical, a bit more threatening, but also a bit more just, because the hero wins in the end and the goodies win in the end over the baddies. than the real world. And it's pure escapism, even though over the last few years they've become more realistic in certain ways. But they still transport you to a different place and make you dream.
If you're looking for action, if you're looking for adventure, if you're looking to escape your ho-hum life, look no further than the James Bond franchise.
When you see a Bond film, every cent that's spent on the film is to entertain and amuse you. And if you're lucky, when you leave the film, you'll have gained a new friend, James Bond. He's here to save the world. He's always competent. He's always cool. He'll take care of you, and he'll do the job right. So go see the film and you'll have a blast.